My grandfather was a combat pilot, a man of few words, yet someone I always admired, even though he kept a certain distance from the world around him. It wasn't until I grew older that I began to understand why he seemed so detached, so constantly on alert. I came to realize that it wasn't just a trait of his personality. He had seen things, lived through horrors that left marks no one could see. Shell shock, PTSD. These were just some of the names for what he carried with him. My mother often told me that he wasn't always like this, that he had changed after coming back from Vietnam. Something had been broken inside him during those years, something that was never truly fixed. As a child, I found myself inexplicably fascinated with planes, astronauts, and the vast, mysterious expanse of space. My grandpa's profession was likely the reason for this, as we often talked about aviation and space travel whenever we were together. He had been a highly skilled officer in the Army, well-ranked and well-connected, having known some notable astronauts personally. On one occasion, I asked him whether he had ever met anyone who had been to the moon. His response, curt and chilling, was simply, "Don't ever talk to me about the moon, boy. It's a dark and evil place." That was all he ever said about it, and I never brought it up again. Grandpa passed away in 2004 from natural causes, and life went on. About 2 months ago, my family decided it was time to renovate my grandparents' old house, a place full of memories, both cherished and haunting. While clearing out the attic, I stumbled upon an old metallic box, dusty and forgotten. Inside the box, I found a number of items that seemed to belong to my grandfather. His military medal, a stack of papers, and an old photograph that caught my attention. In the photograph, my grandfather looked to be in his early 40s, so I assumed it had been taken sometime in the 1970s. He was standing with two other men I didn't recognize, all three dressed in spacesuits. The backdrop looked like the typical one used by NASA, yet there was something off. The NASA logo was missing, and there was only a blank, monochrome background. The mission patch on their suits read Dawnbreaker. I had never heard of such a mission. Was my grandfather secretly an astronaut? And if so, why had he never spoken about it? Why had he kept this part of his life hidden from the world? The mystery deepened when I uncovered the papers at the bottom of the box. What I found there, I must warn you, is deeply disturbing and might be unsettling for some. Here's what it said. "My dear family, if you find this, I must confess something I've kept hidden for many years. In 1972, I wasn't in Vietnam. I wasn't supposed to tell anyone, but now that this has been found, I suppose it no longer matters. Back in 1965, I, along with a select group of other pilots, was recruited for a highly classified space program. We were to be a part of covert missions for our government, missions that no one would ever know about. We wouldn't receive the fame or glory of regular astronauts. Our job was to serve our country in the shadows, and that's what we did. In early 1972, we were briefed about a top-secret satellite that had been orbiting the moon. The government never explained what the satellite had been doing there or why it was so important, only that a few weeks prior, it had crashed on the dark side of the moon, and that the data it carried was crucial. We were sent to recover the memory module of the satellite. Our mission was carried out under the code name Apollo 18, but it was kept so secret that NASA was kept in the dark about it. The Apollo team was furious when they found out about our mission, and frankly, I understood why. Whoever was in charge of our operation was far more powerful than NASA itself. The whole mission was a covert operation. I was officially stationed in Vietnam, but in reality, I was undergoing extensive training for what would become the most dangerous and extraordinary mission of my life. After months of preparation, I found myself standing on the launch pad, staring up at the enormous rocket that would carry us to the moon. I was the mission commander, LT. Carver was the Lunar Excursion Module, LEM, pilot, and LT. Ackerman was the Command/Service Module, CSM, pilot. The journey to the moon took about 3 days, and during that time, I often found myself filled with a mix of awe and unease. As we orbited the moon, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation every time we flew behind the moon's horizon. It was as if, once hidden behind the moon, we became completely cut off from the rest of the world, our communications blocked by the massive rock between US and Earth. The dark side of the moon was nothing like what we were taught to expect. It was covered in deep craters and jagged holes, as though it were slowly being devoured by the void of space itself. We finally began our descent to the surface, landing inside a vast crater on the dark side. The sunlight here was dimmer, but still enough to see clearly. We spent a tense hour and a half waiting for confirmation from Ackerman before stepping out onto the moon's surface. I felt the weight of history on my shoulders as I made my first steps, but the silence was overwhelming. We quickly got to work, setting up our rover and planting the flag. As we drove across the barren lunar surface, I thought I saw something in the distance, a flash of light, like a reflection off something metallic. It wasn't uncommon to see such flashes caused by space radiation, so I didn't think much of it at the time. After hours of driving, we reached the location of the satellite. But when we arrived, something was wrong. There were dozens of footprints surrounding the wreckage and two deep tracks leading away from it. "What the hell is this?" Carver asked, his voice filled with disbelief. We soon realized that someone else had gotten to the data before us. Whoever had been there before us had left their marks, and they were not American. The data we came for was gone. Our communications with Ackerman quickly escalated as we tried to make sense of what had happened. "Who would have taken it?" he asked. "Russians? They don't even have a lunar program," he said, baffled. "But even if someone had stolen the data, how had they gotten here without us knowing? How had the Russians landed on the moon without detection?" With no other leads, we followed the tracks, hoping to find answers. It wasn't long before we spotted another spacecraft in the distance. It was unlike anything we had seen, clearly of Soviet design, with the Soviet flag emblazoned on its side. But there was something strange about it. If the Russians were on the moon, they would have intercepted our communications long ago. So why were they hiding? Despite repeated attempts, we couldn't make contact with the craft. We made our way closer, and as we approached, the odd feeling intensified. The spacecraft seemed abandoned, its interior a mess, with brownish-red fluid spattered across the floor. There was no sign of the crew. Only one spacesuit remained, hanging near the airlock, the name tag mysteriously missing. It became clear to both of us. One of the crew members was still out there, somewhere on the moon, and something had gone terribly wrong. This expanded version includes more atmosphere, detail, and internal thoughts, while maintaining the core structure of your original story. At this point, our oxygen supply was running dangerously low, and there was no time to waste. We rushed as fast as we could toward our spacecraft, hoping to make it back before we ran out completely. As we approached Sharon, our suits nearly devoid of oxygen, a chilling realization struck me. "Carver, tell me, did we pass the wreckage on our way back?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No, we didn't," Carver replied with a grim tone. "It was gone. We didn't pass it. It wasn't there." We shared this unsettling discovery with Ackerman later, and his response mirrored our own unease. Command was equally shocked when they were informed. The day dragged on, and I was assigned to take the first watch of the night. Though technically it wasn't night yet, the sun was still high in the sky. For the sake of our routine, we referred to the time we slept as night. Eventually, when my turn to rest came, I drifted off into a deep sleep. The dream that came to me was unlike any other I had experienced. It was the same flash of light I had witnessed the previous day, and I followed its faint trail, walking deeper and deeper into the barren landscape. I found myself standing over the wreckage of the Russian suit we had seen earlier, now abandoned in the dust. The limbs of the suit were contorted at unnatural angles, clearly the result of some horrific force. But despite the disturbing state of the suit, there was a clear indication that something, or someone, was still trapped inside. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I carefully began to open the sun shield, desperate to see inside. What I saw nearly made me freeze with terror. It was my own face staring back at me, but it was covered in thick, brownish-red blood. And where my eyes should have been were two gaping, hollow voids. A wave of horror washed over me. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The next day, something strange happened. As we went about our routine, a faint signal appeared on a previously unused channel on our radio. We tried to boost it through the speakers, but all we could hear was an odd, distorted sound, a single vowel drawn out for 3 seconds, followed by an equal pause. The sounds were slightly different with each repetition, and it was clear that this wasn't some loop. There was something there. We just couldn't make sense of it. After eating and preparing for our next moonwalk, the atmosphere had noticeably darkened. The sun was still present, but it was steadily sinking below the horizon. We set off in the rover, heading toward the source of the signal. An hour later, we discovered something strange in the dust. It was another spacesuit exactly like the one from the Russian lander. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Carver, his voice tinged with disbelief, muttered, "Looks like we found our missing friend." I didn't respond. Without a word, I jumped off the rover and moved closer, my every step filled with a rising sense of dread. Carver called after me, "What are you doing, Miller?" Just as I reached the suit, something unexpected happened. It came to life. A cold hand gripped mine, sending a shock through my body. Weakly, over the radio, I heard a faint voice whisper, "Pomagite, help," in Russian. We rushed him back to our lander, where the patch on his suit confirmed his identity, Tarkov. He was in a state of shock, suffering from hypoxia. I couldn't comprehend how or why he had been lying out there alone, but his survival was nothing short of miraculous. For hours, he was in and out of consciousness. Eventually, he came to. Our Russian was poor, but Tarkov spoke enough English for us to communicate. His memory was fragmented. He couldn't remember anything about his crew, his mission, or how he ended up stranded on the surface. But when I looked out of the window, something caught my eye. Our flag was gone, and there were no footprints. It was as if it had vanished. Each of us grew more uneasy by the moment. We requested to terminate the mission, but command refused, emphasizing the importance of recovering the satellite data. Reluctantly, we decided to continue the search the next day, though none of us felt comfortable with it. That night, I had the same nightmare again. This time, I woke up soaked in sweat, panic rising in my chest. I saw Tarkov standing silently by the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He then approached Carver, standing silently by his side, staring at him for several long minutes. I asked him, "Tarkov, what are you doing?" But all he said was something incomprehensible, a muttering of words like them or when. He lay down soon after, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, keeping a careful eye on him, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. The next day, as we were going through Tarkov's suit, we found something unexpected, a map, or at least a crude drawing of the crater. It was marked with a cross a few miles away from our current location. Tarkov didn't know what it meant, but I recognized it immediately. It was in the direction where I had seen the flash the previous day. We had to investigate. Carver and I set out in the rover, leaving Tarkov behind at the Sharon lander. I insisted he stay behind, despite the rover being capable of carrying all three of us. "I don't trust him," I explained to Carver, making sure Tarkov was out of range of our short-range radio. "We land on the moon, don't find the box, and then the probe goes missing. Then we find a Russian who's supposed to be dead but doesn't even remember the last time he used the bathroom," Carver muttered, his voice filled with suspicion. "Now we're heading towards some unknown point on a map he doesn't even recognize. I don't trust him either. Hell, I don't trust a single step we take in that direction." We continued our journey, with the eerie feeling of being watched settling over us. After a while, we arrived at something that still haunts me to this day. There, standing in the middle of the barren landscape, was a black, smooth three-sided pyramid about 10 feet tall. I can't explain why, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Carver's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "What in the world is this?" We circled it, taking pictures, but suddenly Carver froze, his gaze fixed on something. I turned to follow his line of sight and saw it. A spacesuit, standing alone in the fading light, about 20 feet away. I recognized it immediately as one of the suits from the Russian spacecraft. It was standing upright. The sun shield was open. And then I saw the most horrifying thing imaginable. It was empty. The suit was vacant, but it remained perfectly upright. Before I could process what was happening, the radio crackled to life, and I heard a distorted, unnatural voice. "You don't belong here." A blinding flash of light erupted before my eyes. When my vision returned to normal, the suit was gone, vanished without a trace. "Carver?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are you all right?" His response came slowly, filled with dread. "Man, fuck NASA. Fuck the Army, fuck the satellite, fuck this whole mission. I want out of here now." Without further discussion, we rushed back to the rover and headed for Sharon. By the time we returned, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the surface bathed in an oppressive darkness. The airlock was open, and there, standing in front of the module, was Tarkov still in his suit. In the chaos, we had completely forgotten about him. I approached him, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tarkov was holding something behind his back. Before I could react, it was too late. He swung, striking me with a sharp, makeshift rod. I felt a jolt of pain as my helmet slammed into the inside of my suit. When I regained my senses, I saw Carver and Tarkov locked in a desperate struggle. I lunged at Tarkov, throwing us both to the ground. As we rolled, I managed to grab a sharp rock and struck him in the head. His visor cracked, and I saw his air slowly escaping as the seal broke. His last words were chilling. "He is not your friend. Follow the voice." Tarkov collapsed, his body falling lifeless atop me. As I tried to catch my breath, I noticed Carver bleeding heavily from a puncture in his suit. His blood, thick and dark, was being pulled into the vacuum of space. I struggled to keep him alive, but we had no first aid kit. The Russian lander was our only hope. "Go get it, Miller," Carver urged weakly. "Don't let me die out here." I grabbed the first aid kit from the Russian lander, but as I returned to Sharon, I couldn't shake the voice that Tarkov had spoken of. Who was the voice? Who wasn't my friend? As I headed back to the rover, the signal grew stronger and I followed it. What awaited me at the crater would haunt me forever. In the center of the crater, there was a black pit, an ominous, gaping void, and before it stood a massive shape. It was Tarkov. No, it wasn't. The figure was towering, monstrous, and unmistakable. Its body was human-shaped, but the limbs twisted and curved unnaturally. It reached down to me, and I realized with horror that I had finally met the thing that had been lurking in the shadows all along. The last thing I heard was Carver's voice echoing in my head. "No one's ever meant to find us.